Welcome, everybody, to the Legends of Baseball show on the Gruely Crew Sports Network. I'm your host, Mike Goodpaster, and today we have a special guest, actually a two-time All-Star, won over 200 games in his career, threw a no-hitter. Help me welcome to the show, Jerry Royce. How you doing, Jerry?
Hey, everything's good, Mike. Great to be here.
All right, so from what I read, you were born in St. Louis. Did you grow up in St. Louis?
Born and raised in St. Louis. Actually, it was the northern suburbs, for anyone who knows about St. Louis. To get specific, I was about 3 miles south of the airport, so that gives you roughly an idea.
All right, so were you a one-sport athlete, just baseball, or did you play multiple sports when you were a kid?
Well, as a kid, I played everything that we could, baseball, basketball, a little bit of football, but mainly it was just baseball and basketball. I tried 1 year of football at high school. It just didn't click, so I stuck to basketball and baseball. Basketball because I knew that if I would develop, I'd have a better chance for a scholarship, and baseball because that was my first love.
Yeah. So baseball was your first love. When did you first begin to realize that maybe you could play this at a higher level?
Well, every year that I ever played, I played at a pretty high level. For my age group, through Little League, I played well, made most of the all-star teams, whether I pitched or played first base. And as I got to high school, suddenly it changed around a little bit. The guys who were a little bit older and played better than me, I had suddenly caught up with them. And by the time I was in my senior year, I was ready to advance to another level.
And that other level was the second round of the 1967 Major League Baseball draft. And you get drafted by the Cardinals. I assume you were a Cardinal fan, so that had to be a huge moment for you.
You know, it was, but it was more surprising than anything else because the Cardinals and their scouts were in the background. I never saw them, never heard from them, didn't even know they were there. And what even makes it more odd is the fact that one of my teammates on the high school team, his dad was the scouting director for the Cardinals.
That makes it even easier to get seen.
Yeah, but, it does. But when when the club doesn't contact you and send out any positive vibes, you get the feeling that they just weren't interested. There were other clubs, other organizations that were around, more visible, and they let it be known that there was a certain degree of interest.
All right. So, what was the adjustment like for you when you got to the minor leagues?
You know, that first day that I showed up to Al Lang Field, after I flew down, I took one look at what was going on in the field, and everybody there was equivalent to the guys I played against in high school team, a high school all-star team, and then a few more who were probably even more outstanding where they played than what I was where I played.
Now, you won your first Major League Baseball game in 1969. Tell us about, number one, when you found out you were going to get called up and what that first win was like for you.
Well, we'll step back just a little bit. I signed in June of 67, played a half season in 68. I got my first year of college in and didn't join the AA Little Rock team until the middle of the season. And then I joined an Army Reserve group, which meant that I didn't go to school full time and was able to play a full season in 69. Fortunately for me, a lot of things worked out my way. One was expansion, and the Cardinals being one of the top organizations in 67 and 68, as evidenced by the fact that they went to the World Series both those years. You couple those two things, it opened up some spots, and I happened to be in the right place at the right time because from the time I signed until the time I pitched my first Major League game was a period of 27 months.
Yeah, that's unheard of nowadays to do it that quick. And was it intimidating to go to the Cardinals? You talked about they'd won the World Series in 67, they lost to Detroit in 68, but you had Bob Gibson on the same staff.
Yeah, it was intimidating, but thank God for ignorance because at 19 years old, I didn't know enough to be intimidated. I thought that this was, this is just the way it was. But when I came to spring training in 1969, this was after Gibson had probably the greatest year that a pitcher could ever have. That was back in 1968. I knew it was good, but it took years of taking a look at numbers and comparing the best season that Gibson had with the best of the best seasons that anybody had. He ranked right there at the top, and it depends on how you want to take the numbers or to the people you talk to. If this Gibson 68 season was the greatest ever by a pitcher.
What's your opinion on that? You pitched around that time, and I know the mound moved around because of that 68 season and the pitching that went on there. I think it's the same year that Denny McLain won 30 or 31 games. What was the difference in the mound height when you get a year or two later? Do you think that played into any of his success?
I was 19 years old at the time. I didn't know a whole lot about anything. I thought I did, and probably knew about as much for the limited amount of time that I was on this planet. But I realized later that I was sheltered from the realities of baseball and life in general, and gradually I had to learn about them. So as far as the mound itself, lowering it from 15 to 10 inches, it was an adjustment, but at 19, 20 years old, it wasn't that much of an adjustment because I was young and had to make the adjustment myself with other things as well, as far as location, pitch selection. So all of those things came at one time.
All right. So at that time, did you have a job in the off season? Because I know players didn't make near what they make today.
Well, not a paying job, because I was in the military and I had 2 weeks of camp. I was fortunate that those 2 weeks of camp could be done in the off season. Then there were some meetings that I took early so that it wouldn't interfere with the season. And if there was time, I went back to school and was able to get a term in before spring training. So there really wasn't any time for a job. And because I got all of my innings in every year that I pitched, there was no need to go to winter ball. So, my winters, they were busy either with military duty or with going to school.
All right. Now, the spring of '72, you had a contract dispute over money with Cardinals owner Gussie Busch. You ended up forcing a trade or being traded because they wouldn't budge off of that. What was it like? You're in your hometown of St. Louis now. All of a sudden, you're in Houston.
Well, it was more than just money. I thought for years it was all about money. But as it turns out, it was because I grew a mustache and Augie Busch didn't like it. And he was now it seems strange and probably taken out of context.
I'm a Cincinnati Reds fan, so that doesn't really blow my mind because that's how the Reds were when I was growing up in the 70s.
Yeah, it's probably it was a little bit like that. But the Cardinals, and considering Augie Busch, though he had his conservative leanings toward things, he was also someone who went out on a limb for somebody and took care of him. When Curt Flood had some business problems, Busch took care of it, helped put Curt Flood back on his feet. Going back to the early 60s, when the Cardinals had spring in St. Petersburg, he found out that black players couldn't get accommodations. So what he did is he rented out 2 hotels and put all of the players in the hotels. Both Stan and Red, who had rented places on the beach, said, it might be a good idea if we stay at the hotel this spring as a means to have team community. So they moved. They were with all the players. And as it turned out, it was a pretty good thing because there were some wives at the time who were teachers. And they organized with the players who had kids in school and were able to call the teachers and have everything sent to Florida for whatever time these kids were going to be there. Plus, there were community nights where everybody brought a dish and they experienced different cultures all at the same time. So it was one of those situations where everybody in the team became closer, but that really wasn't the reason why it was done. But it could all go back to Augie Busch, who said, I want to make this and I want to make it right. So it seems strange that someone who has that kind of forethought would have a problem later in that decade, in the 60s, with players. He had dealt with unions with his brewery, but for whatever reason, he resented Marvin Miller heading the players' union. So he became a bit of a hawk as far as owners were concerned. He didn't want someone playing with his toys. And Miller came along, and he resented it. And then when the strike happened in 1969, he took it personally. Steve Carlton had a contract dispute in 69. They eventually settled it, but when it came up, the contract came up, and 2 years later, he had traded Carlton because he got tired of dealing with somebody who he believed couldn't be satisfied.
Yeah.
Now, caught in the wake of all of these things was me. And there was a difference in opinion as far as the amount of money, and I didn't sign a contract. So I went down to spring training. He saw the mustache, and for whatever reason, that was the last straw.
He never brought it up to you?
He brought it up to either Red or Bing Devine and said, tell him to get rid of it. I don't like mustaches. And that was it. And then, so, he held tight to it. And Bing Devine told me some years later, usually when Mr. Bush got angry about something, we gave him a little time, and if he settled down, we kind of let it pass. But this one he stayed on. He stayed on it for a week, almost to the point to where he told Bing, either you get rid of him or I get rid of you. Bing didn't have a choice.
Yeah. All right, so you go to Houston, 1972-73. Number one guy I'm going to ask you about, because he was on the roster in 1973. I don't know if it was 72. It was J.R. Richard.
Yeah.
He was one of the most dominant pitchers I ever saw. I got to see him in person at Riverfront Stadium like 1978-79. You want to talk a little bit about him and what could have been with him?
Well, you knew he was going to be good, that's for sure. He wasn't really, I guess he wasn't ready. I don't remember that much about him because he was in 1973. But I think he made something like 20 starts, was impressive. Maybe he was called up later in the season. Like I said, that's over 40 years ago, so my memory isn't so good, particularly on other players. But he's going to be good once he found himself. So he eventually did and became one of the most dominant right-handers up until the time that he had his stroke.
Yeah. You're with the Astros. The Astros actually had some talent. I think they were above 500 both years you were there. And you got, I don't know if this is a privilege or not. I don't know how to ask this because I've talked to a few other guys that have coached, but were managed by Leo DeRocher, and not all of them had great things to say. But what were your dealings with manager DeRocher?
Well, Leo was abrasive. There's no doubt about it. And when he was in the clubhouse, you knew it. And he had that kind of personality that poured over everything that was in the clubhouse. Whether you like that or not, that's just the way he was. But Leo, he said it in his book that he was going to make a change. He was going to accommodate players. And as a result, he was going to be their friend, their pal, their buddy. In fact, he was proud of the fact that he instigated card games about a half hour before players went out. And that caused a lot of grumbling because, well, a lot of guys didn't want to play cards, but Leo pushed them into the games. And instead of thinking about the guy they're facing that night or the opposition in general, they might have been more concerned going onto the field about the money they lost in the card game as opposed to being concerned about who was pitching and what the team we were playing. So I don't think it did a whole lot of good. So Leo, he was 65, 66 years old, something like that, managing guys in their mid-20s. Now, nobody in their mid-20s wants a 66-year-old pal, particularly one who takes your money in card games.
Yeah.
So, yeah, there was a lot of resentment, and it became more of a distraction when he came into the clubhouse than what it should have been. It was a good ball club. It was a very good ball club. The year before might have even been better because guys were a year younger, and the pitching stayed healthy that whole year. I think the Astros scored more runs than any other National League team, but the pitching with Cincinnati was a little bit better than what the Astros had that year. And then in 73, I came along. Dave Roberts was probably the best pitcher all around for the ball club. I had 40 starts, but Larry Dierker was hurt. Don Wilson had his problems, and those were the big two guys who ate up the innings. So there were a couple of years where there were some good teams, but the offense, the defense, the management couldn't put it all together in one particular year to bring the Astros to the postseason.
Yeah, and then you end up getting traded from Milt May to the Pittsburgh Pirates. The Pirates were a great team at that time. You had your first All-Star year in 1975. I think you won 18 games. You want to talk a little bit about that season and what it was like to be selected to the All-Star game for the first time?
Well, I'll talk a little bit about that, but first let me talk about Milt May. Pirates played Milt May and put Manny Sanguillen in right field after Roberto Clemente had passed. So it wasn't working, and they realized that Sanguillen needed to be behind the plate. But they had a blue-chip prospect because Milt May was a left-handed batter, and in his time with Pittsburgh, he hit .270 and was able to handle pitchers. So it was Joe Brown with the Pirates that needed pitching and had an expendable catcher, and the Astros wanted someone who could catch every day because Johnny Edwards was getting a little older, and also Milt May was a left-handed batter in a sea of right-handed hitters for the Astros. So the deal was made. They figured May would catch 120 games as opposed, and that was better than having me as a starter who had pitched 279 innings and 41 appearances, 40 of them being starts. So the deal was made. It covered the bases for both clubs, at least on paper. I went to Pittsburgh, won 16, and then won 18 in 75.
Yeah, and you end up starting the All-Star game in 1975. I believe you were the starter, weren't you, in Milwaukee?
I was. That was interesting, the way the rotation worked out, and I owe all that to Danny Murtaugh. He had put the pitching rotation together at Pittsburgh so that we had a 4-game series just before the All-Star break in Atlanta. I told Danny, I said, with the All-Star break coming up, if you need me in relief, I can do it for you. He says, I appreciate that. But I never pitched in relief. And when it came time for Walt Alston, who was managing the 75 All-Star team, he took a look around and saw who had the most rest, and I was it. And with the insistence of Murtaugh and him supporting me, I was named the starting pitcher.
Oh, and that had to be the thrill of a lifetime to be starting in the Major League Baseball All-Star game.
Oh, it was, no doubt about it. I was very fortunate in the fact that I played 2 All-Star games, was the starting pitcher in one, went 3 innings, and was the winning pitcher in the other, and that's in 1980, and I'm sure that's in your notes somewhere as well.
Yeah, I don't even need notes for that. I remember that because I think, wasn't Ken Griffey the MVP of that?
Yeah, he had a 2-run homer, and It was right after I came into the ball game, so I was the pitcher of record. The National League guys who came in after me held the fort, and I was able to eke out a win. That was at home at Dodger Stadium. In fact, it was the last time that the Dodgers had the All-Star game. And it'll be 40 years from 1980 until 2020 when they host it again.
Yeah, my problem is I've kind of lost interest in baseball since about the early 90s, but it doesn't matter. That's why I interview guys like you, because I don't have to look up as much stuff. 1975, I'm doing off some memory, but I think you started Game 1 of the NLCS against the Reds, didn't you?
Yeah, I did.
Okay, tell us what it was like
Cincinnati
to face that team, because I know I'm a homer here, but I still don't think I've ever seen a better offensive lineup than the Big Red Machine.
There were no holes. Even the guys who were pitchers could swing a bat, or they could put down a bunt. So there was no holes 1 through 8, and it didn't matter whether you were a lefty or a righty. If you had control over one guy, there was somebody in that lineup who had a pretty good year against you. or a pretty good career. So you put all of that together. If one doesn't get you, the other was. So
Yeah.
that's they were that good.
Yeah, because I remember guys like Don Gullett. Don Gullett, I think, hit a home run in that series, didn't he?
Yeah.
I couldn't remember which game, but I think it was game one, but I'm not sure. You look at that, you end up going to Los Angeles, 1979. That had to be exciting just because 77 to 78, the Dodgers had come up just a little bit short. You're going to go play for Tommy Lasorda. What was it like to play for manager Lasorda?
Well, each manager has a different personality, and they run things different. Everybody I played for 15 different major league managers. All were qualified. All were good. But not all things were created equal for managers with regards to their club or the years that they happened to manage. Some of the lesser teams finished under 500, and there's not really a whole lot that a manager can do in that particular situation because you're playing to keep from losing a game as opposed to winning a pennant. So you become short-sighted on what it is you hope to achieve with the organization. But on the other hand, when you have a team like the Pirates, who were perennially in the pennant race every September, and the Dodgers, who were likewise, these were two teams that most players wanted to play for. The difference between Los Angeles and Pittsburgh, for me, is that it was a new beginning. There were guys who had come through the Pirates, and they were doing a lot better than I was. So I was expendable, and the deal was made with Los Angeles where they needed a left-hander. So it worked out for both clubs. But the advantage, playing in Pittsburgh on that tartan turf, it just wears out your legs.
Yeah.
And you knew that Stargell had a problem because of it. Dave Parker eventually had a knee replacement because of the years on artificial turf. So going out to Los Angeles, playing on natural grass, was a little easier on your body. Plus, the weather in Los Angeles during the summer was as good as you're going to get anywhere.
Yeah, you don't have to worry about the April in Pittsburgh where it's 30 degrees.
Yeah, so there were a lot of advantages to playing in Los Angeles because it was a team you knew was going to be in the hunt every year. So I went from one good team to another one and made a couple of adjustments over the winter of 79 and 80 and turned my career around.
Yeah, and you talked about it. 1980 had to be your best year, I would think. Second to Cy Young voting behind Steve Carlton. You were the comeback player of the year. And then the question I got to ask is the no-hitter, June 27th against the Giants. Just walk us through that, especially headed out to the mound for the ninth inning when you know that you only need 3 more outs to do something very few people do.
Well, there are some pitchers who say that they weren't aware that they had a no-hitter going. So right away, I'm going to tell you right up front, I knew from the first pitch that I had a no-hitter going. And because I can read the scoreboard like anybody else.
Yeah.
And I was aware of what every hitter did at the plate, what adjustments he would make the next time he came to the plate, or what adjustments he would make within an at-bat. So I knew what was going on, and coupled with the fact that I had 8 runs to work with about the middle part of the ball game, I changed my way of pitching for, probably the only time in my career, as when you have a shutout, even though you've given up a couple of hits, you want to test some things with the other guys on the other team because you might learn something. But when you have a no-hitter going, you realize that, with a little bit of luck, the hitter can squib one off the end of the bat, it can die in the high grass, and it's an infield hit. Or you can jam somebody, they bloop it over the infield, and a base hit, and there goes the prospects for a no-hitter. So you try, at least for me, I was trying to be better than perfect and make my pitches and make perfect pitches one right after the other. For 4 or 5 innings, that's tough to do. So I had to have a lot of luck and a couple of good defensive plays behind me.
Yeah, and also 1980 comeback player of the year. That was also a great pennant race where you guys ended up going down and playing the extra playoff game against the Astros. The Astros had some great teams back then, too. And the thing that stands out to me about baseball is what I try to tell all these young – I hate to sound old, but as I try to tell all these young people today, I mean, in the 70s, into the 80s, there was like really 5 or 6 great baseball teams. And if you look at that NL West, you had the Reds, you had the Dodgers, the Astros at the start of the 70s and the end of the 70s was good. I think the Giants won a division in 71. I mean, if you look at the National League East at the time, I mean, you had some great teams there with the Phillies and the Pirates. It just seems like the depth was so much better back then.
Well, maybe so. There seemed to be a star player in every ball club, and if you coupled it with a guy having a good season or another star player, suddenly a team that was in the middle of the pack could also compete in September. And it made a pennant race out of it. You were right with the teams you named. The Pirates, they were always in the hunt. The Phillies were a pretty good ball club. And then in the late 70s, the Expos came on.
Yeah.
You take a look at the other divisions. Houston suddenly became a force because they had some pretty good pitching. We talked about J.R. Richard, but the Astros also signed Nolan Ryan. And there was Joe Niekro, who was a 20-game winner. He pitched for him as well. So those are 3 guys on the top of your staff that are pretty good.
Yeah.
You put that together with the Reds, who did find some able replacements for the cogs of the big red machine, but again, they were replacements. They were good, and they kept Cincinnati in the hunt, but there was something special about those mid-70s teams because these guys played so well together for such a long period of time. And that's something that you can't teach kids. That's something that they have to earn, and usually by the time that they've learned it, other new kids have come along because other players grow a little bit older, or it's time to move them because of what you have to pay them. So, the Big Red Machine had to make some changes themselves. So there's always that transition going on. But if you look around the league, you saw that there were some pretty good players.
All right, 1981. Let's just do a quick overview. What was the reason for the strike? I've read a lot of stuff, but I know you were a Major League Baseball player then. What was the reason for that strike?
Well, simply put, it was money. And it was money that owners would have to pay to players for free agency, and free agency was the bargaining tool. They wanted to modify free agency into something that was more like a trade between 2 clubs. If you sign a free agent, you got to give up something. Well, that's a glorified trade. And eventually what they worked out was a compensation system, which meant that you can protect so many players if one of your players is signed as a free agent. Let me see if I'm going to get this right. If a team signed a free agent, I guess they had to put so many players into the pool off their 40-man roster so that other teams who lost a free agent could choose from what was in there and then take that player onto their roster. It was still a glorified trade, and eventually, it was modified to where a number of times to where it is today.
Yeah, so basically you're saying the 81 player strike, the players probably got the best of that, correct?
Well, I would say so because it kept free agency intact. It helped raise salaries, and though baseball struggled a little bit, they've always seemed to come through with something that saved their bacon. And in those days, it had to do with the networks putting money into the pool for the radio and TV. And then after that, there was expansion. And then after that, the internet came along. And when you put all those things together, baseball was swimming in money. And they were able to afford free agents. But I think over the years, they got wise, stopped complaining about what they had to pay players, and realized that if they advertised it, they showed their fan base that they were willing to put a winning team on the field by going after this free agent or that one.
Yeah. 1981 still is a sore spot with me. I'm a Reds fan. We had the best record in baseball, Jerry. We still feel screwed. And actually, if I remember right, the Cardinals had the best record in the East, and neither one of them even got to the playoffs.
Yeah, it was one of those unfortunate things that had to do with timing. a few days either way would have changed the course of history.
Yeah. Then you go on, 1981. You talked about that Expos team a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about the 81 NLCS. One of the great NLCSs I think I've seen. Rick Monday hits the home run at the end of the game. The weird thing there is I was like in 8th grade at the time, and I remember not being able to watch the game until I got home, and I got home right in the 9th inning. But that had to be a huge one. You get to go to the World Series now. I mean, 1981, you win in Game 5, Rick Monday's home run. You want to tell us what that experience was and how it felt to know that you were finally going to reach that promised land?
Well, you have to go back a series before then. Because of the strike, the commissioner decided that it would be playoffs between two divisions, and then to qualify for the league championship series. So there was a first half winner, and then a second half determined who was going to play in the postseason. The Astros won that. And in that 5-game series, we were down by 2 games, stormed back to win 3 consecutive one-run games at Dodger Stadium to move on to the series against the Expos. They had us down. They were 1 game away from advancing to the World Series, but we won 2 consecutive games in Montreal, the last one with the aforementioned home run by Rick Monday. And then it was time to go to New York. And promptly in New York, we dropped the first 2 games and then won the next 4 when we came back to Los Angeles and had 3 more one-run wins. And then went back to New York. There was a travel day, a rainout, and finally we played them on a Wednesday night and beat them pretty handily 9-2 to capture the World Championship.
Yeah, and you pitched Game 5 of that series, which was 2-2 at the time. Do you consider that the biggest game you've ever pitched?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Wasn't the best, but it was good enough. And it's one of those things that teaches you that you don't really need to be your best, have your best stuff to win. In fact, I was overthrowing in the game and was outpitched by Ron Guidry up until the point where he gave up 2 home runs on 5 pitches that changed the tempo of that game and also the momentum in the World Series.
Ron Guidry was one of the best pitchers I ever saw, too. And it's a shame people tend to overlook and forget about him.
Oh, he was. I saw him in the World Series a couple of times and batted against him in the World Series game. So, I got a first-hand look at just how good he could be.
So what's your take on the DH? Do you think they should do away with it, or do you like the DH?
Either way, right now, at this point, I've been out of it 29 years. I've seen it where a DH prolongs the career of someone who becomes a great hitter, and that adds to the game. But also having the pitcher hit and doing things the more classic way is still the game of baseball. I would think that over time you would have one brand of baseball and that would be it. But surprising to me, it stayed the way it has as long as it has, and it appears as if there's no reason for anyone to want to change, at least to the point to where either players are willing to strike over it or ownership is going to insist on it in a negotiation.
Yeah, and I'm still upset the Houston Astros played the Dodgers in the World Series because to me, that's still an NL West playoff game.
Yeah, historically you could see that. That's just one of those things. It's one of the quirks that baseball now has because of interleague play. I'm not too happy about an interleague play.
No,
it cheapens the postseason.
Yeah, it ruins it. It was great when you'd watch the Reds play the Red Sox and they hadn't played all year, and there's some mystery there of how they match up. That mystery's pretty much gone most of the time now.
Well, when a team comes in and plays a 3-game series in June, and then they match up again in October for the World Series, it kind of takes the drama out of it. But it's something that baseball's doing now. They may make that change sooner or later. It remains to be seen. I guess in radio parlance, stay tuned.
Yeah, and the other thing is this. I remember when the baseball game of the week, if the Yankees were playing the Rangers, where I lived, all the kids were coming in to watch it because we never got to see the American League. And I think a lot of sports now, I think, has been dumbed down and not as, I don't think it's as big a deal as what it used to be, just because you could see almost every game.
Well, if you have the right package, or you can pirate the games so that you can see them, that's one thing. Because we couldn't get, growing up in St. Louis, we never got the game of the week because we were within 50 miles of a major league city. So the only time I got to see the American League was at the All-Star game or in the World Series.
Yeah, and I still remember watching the 1975 All-Star game from Milwaukee because I wanted to see Hank Aaron. And the Big Red Machine, 75, 76, the Reds back then, we got 44 away games. They'd show opening day home game, and then there would be one surprise game during August or September we would get, and that was it. So it was a huge deal to listen to Marty Brennaman and Joe Nuxall on the radio, and I think a lot of that has really hurt the game.
Well, I don't know if it's hurt it. It was different. It was the technology that existed in those times, and times have changed.
I know, but I didn't want them to.
No, well, you can't stop it. Now you can watch a game on your phone. Yeah. And if you're fortunate enough to live in the right zip code, you can follow a team just about everywhere and see their games in one form or fashion.
Yeah, and we talked about that. You were a baseball broadcaster working nationally for ESPN in the early 90s. What was that like? I think, weren't you also a color commentator for the Angels?
I worked for a lot of different people. ESPN was first. Then I did some games for Sports Channel. That was before it was all bought up by Fox. I did some college games, did some, all kinds of games. Even the Arizona Fall League, I did some TV for them when they had their own package. Of course, now everything is under MLB or Fox or some of the postseason games that you see on some of the other cable programs. So, with that, it's all changed since I got into broadcasting. But I did work for ESPN. I did games for Baseball Night in America. Remember that?
Yeah.
And then I did 3 years with the Angels, coached for a couple of years, and then got a 3-year deal to do radio for the Dodgers. And since then, I've been doing minor league games here in Las Vegas.
All right, so you broached a little bit that you coached with the Cubs. I think it was the Iowa Cubs, wasn't it, for a couple of years?
Yeah, it was 3 years. 3 years in AAA with the Cubs.
Was that
I
something did you enjoy it, or just something you didn't want to pursue to a higher level, or?
Parts of it I really liked. Parts of it I did. Other parts, as far as the bookkeeping and taking care of a lot of things that really didn't interest me, I did it, and I did it to the best of my ability. So when you look at it like that, there's good things about every job, and then there's some things that you just got to do because it's part of the job description.
Yeah. And I know you wrote a book about your career also, correct? A couple years ago? Yeah,
I did. In 2014, it was finally published. I titled it Bring in the Right-Hander.
So if people want to read that book, can they find it on Amazon or?
Oh yeah, you can find it. You can find it on Amazon, maybe even in a brick and mortar bookstore. But if you want a personally signed, brand new, practically untouched copy, you can go to jerryroyce.com and it'll give you instructions on how to get one.
All right. Jerry, I know I've kept you a lot longer than I said I would. I apologize for that. It was great to have you on the show, though.
It was a good conversation. We covered a lot of things, mostly my career. And it's much like the book in the sense that there were career highs, career lows, all against the backdrop of the 70s and 80s. And then after I retired from the game, into the 90s and on up to today. So we got a lot done in a short period of time. I appreciate that.
And we would love to have you back sometime. Maybe do you follow baseball during the season?
I do. I watch the minor league games, but the big league games, there are 30 teams, and there's a lot to keep track of.
And the game takes like 4 hours every game.
Yeah, if you pour through the papers, if you pour through what's on the internet, you watch some of the highlights that come through. It takes up a lot of time, and considering the fact that baseball's been a part of my life since I was 5 years old, there's got to be a time as I approach 70 to do some of the other things that, for one reason or another, I never got a chance to do, and I'm in the process of doing them. How about this? A summer vacation. A lot of people take that summer vacation. As a player, growing up and through my career years, I was never able to do that. So last 29 years, I had to work, in some cases around the baseball schedule, but now I got some Jerry time. And with that, I'm doing a lot of other things that really aren't baseball related.
So where does Jerry Royce go when he wants to go on vacation?
I've got a list of places that I'd like to go. I live in the western part of the United States, and there's a whole area up there, the Northwest states, that a lot of people may or may not have seen, but there's a lot up there that I'd like to witness. So that's all on the bucket list, and hopefully I can start crossing some of those things off beginning next summer.
All right, Jerry, I want to thank you for coming on again. You're welcome back anytime. Really appreciate it.
Well, it was a lot of fun. Thank you for having me. Give me a call, and we'll do it again.
All right. Thanks a lot, Jerry. All right,
Thank
guys.
you. Bye.
Yep. To hear more on the Grilling Truth or hear any of our other legend shows, we also had Tommy John on a few months ago. You can go to grillingtruth.net. You can also hear all of our shows on Spotify, iHeartRadio, iTunes, TuneIn, Spreaker, Stitcher. Wherever you find sports podcasts, you'll find the Grilling Truth. So for Jerry Royce, I'm Mike Goodpaster. You've been listening to the Grilling Truth, where the legends speak.